Well, all right. Welcome, listeners from everywhere in time and space. And let us move right along here with Jurgen, a Comedy of Justice by James Branch Cabell. This book was published originally in 1919. And we have made it all the way to chapter 37. Invention of the Lovely Vampire. So again, Koth parted with his son in anger, and Jurgen returned again toward Barathum. And whether or not it was a coincidence, Jurgen met precisely the vampire of whom he had inveigled his father into thinking. She was the most seductively beautiful creature that it would be possible for Jurgen's father or any other man to imagine, and her clothes were orange-colored for a reason sufficiently well known in hell, and were embroidered everywhere with green fig leaves. "A good morning to you, madame," says Jurgen. "And whither are you going?" "Why, to no place at all, good youth, for this is my vacation granted yearly by the law of Kalki." "And who is Kalki, madam?" "Nobody as yet, but he will come as a stallion. Meanwhile, his law precedes him, so that I am spending my vacation peacefully in hell with none of my ordinary annoyances to bother me." "And what, madam, can they be?" "Why, you must understand that it is little rest a vampire gets on earth with so many fine young fellows like yourself going about everywhere, eager to be destroyed." "But how, madam, did you happen to become a vampire if the life does not please you? And what is it that they call you?" "My name, sir," replied the vampire sorrowfully, "is Florimel, because my nature no less than my person was as beautiful as the flowers of the field and as sweet as the honey which the bees, who furnish us with such admirable examples of industry, get out of these flowers. But a sad misfortune changed all this, for I chanced one day to fall ill and die, which of course might happen to anyone. And as my funeral was leaving the house, the cat jumped over my coffin. That was a terrible misfortune to befall a poor dead girl so generally respected and in wide demand as a seamstress. Though even then the worst might have been averted had not my sister-in-law been of what they call a humane disposition and foolishly attached to the cat, so they did not kill it, and I, of course, became a vampire." "Yes, I can understand that was inevitable. Still, it seems hardly fair. I pity you, my dear," and Jurgen sighed. "I would prefer, sir, that you did not address me that familiarly, since you and I have omitted the formality of an introduction, and in the absence of any joint acquaintances are unlikely ever to meet properly." "I have no herald handy, for I travel incognito. However, I am that Jurgen who recently made himself Emperor of Numeria, King of Eubonia, Prince of Compiègne, and Duke of Langres, and of whom you have doubtless heard." "Why, to be sure," says she, patting her hair straight, "and who would have anticipated meeting your highness in such a place?" "One says majesty to an emperor, my dear. It is a detail, of course, but in my position one has to be a little exigent." "I perfectly comprehend your majesty, and indeed I might have divined your rank from your lovely clothes. I can but entreat you to overlook my unintentional breach of etiquette. And I make bold to add that a kind heart reveals the splendor of its graciousness through the interest which your majesty has just evinced in my disastrous history. Upon my word, thinks Jurgen, but in this flow of words I seem to recognize my father's imagination when in anger. Then Florimel told Jurgen of her horrible awakening in the grave, and of what had befallen her hands and feet there, and while that against her will befallen her hands and feet there, the while that against her will she fed repugnantly, destroying first her kindred and then the neighbors. This done, she had arisen, for the cat still lived, and that troubled me. When I had put an end to this annoyance, I climbed into the church belfry, not alone, for one went with me of whom I prefer not to talk, and at midnight I sounded the bell so that all who heard it would sicken and die. And I wept all the while because I knew that when everything had been destroyed which I had known in my first life in the flesh, I would be compelled to go into new lands in search of the food which alone can nourish me. And I was always sincerely attached to my home. So it was, your majesty, that I forever relinquished my sowing and became a lovely peril, a flashing desolation, and an evil which smites by night in spite of my abhorrence of irregular hours. And what I dislike extremely, for it is a sad fate to become a vampire, and still to sympathize with your victims, and particularly with their poor mothers. So Jurgen comforted Florimel, and he put his arm around her. Come, come, he said, but I will see that your vacation passes pleasantly, and I intend to deal fairly with you too. Then he glanced sideways at his shadow and whispered a suggestion which caused Florimel to sigh. By the terms of my doom, said she, at no time during the 9 lives of the cat can I refuse. Still, it is a comfort you are the Emperor of Nomuria, and have a kind heart. Oh, and of many other possessions, my dear, and I again assure you that I intend to deal fairly with you. So Florimel conducted Jurgen through the changeless twilight to Barathum, like that of a gray winter afternoon, to a quiet cleft by the sea of blood, which she had fitted out very cozily in imitation of her girlhood home. And she lighted a candle and made him welcome to her cleft. And when Jurgen was about to enter it, he saw that his shadow was following him into the vampire's home. Let us extinguish this candle, says Jurgen, for I have seen so many flames today that my eyes are tired. So Florimel extinguished the candle with a good will that delighted Jurgen, and now they were in utter darkness, and in the dark nobody can see what is happening. But that Florimel now trusted Jurgen, and his Normurian claims was evinced by her very first remark. I was in the beginning suspicious of your majesty, said Florimel, because I had always heard that every emperor carried a magnificent scepter, and you then displayed nothing of the sort, and now somehow I do not doubt you any longer. And of what is your majesty thinking? Why, I was reflecting, my dear, says Jurgen, that my father imagines things very satisfactorily. Chapter 38. As to applauded precedents. Afterward, Jurgen abode in hell and complied with the customs of that country. And the tale tells that a week or it might have be 10 days after his meeting with Florimel, Jurgen married her without being at all hindered by his having 3 other wives. For the devils he found esteemed polygamy and ranked it above mere skill at torturing the damned, though a literal interpretation of the saying that it is better to marry than to burn. And formerly, they told Jurgen, you could hardly come across a marriage anywhere that was not half marked, made in heaven. But since we have been at war with heaven, we have quite taken away their trade from our enemies, so you may marry here as much as you like. Why then, says Jurgen, I shall marry in haste and repeat it at leisure. But can one obtain a divorce here? Oh no, said they. We trafficked in them for a while, but we found that all persons who obtained divorces through our industry promptly thanked heaven they were free at last. In the face of such ingratitude, we gave over that profitless trade, and now there is a manufactory for specialties in men's clothing upon the old statutory grounds. But these makeshifts are unsatisfactory, and I wish to know in confidence, what do you do in hell when there is no longer any putting up with your wives? The devils all blushed. We would prefer not to tell you, said they, for it might get to their ears. Now do I perceive, said Jurgen, that hell is pretty much like any other place. So Jurgen and the lovely vampire were duly married. First, Jurgen's nails were trimmed, and the parings were given to Florimel. A broomstick was laid before them, and they stepped over it. Then Florimel said, Timon, thrice, and 9 times did Jurgen reply, Aragazator. Afterward, the Emperor Jurgen and his bride were given a posset of dudium and euruca, and the devils modestly withdrew. Thereafter, Jurgen abode in hell and complied with the customs of that country, and was tolerably content for a while. Now Jurgen shared with Florimel that quiet cleft which she had fitted out in imitation of her girlhood home, and they lived in the suburbs of Barathum very respectably by the shore of the sea. There was, of course, no water in hell. Indeed, the importation of water was forbidden, under severe penalties in view of its possible use for baptismal purposes. The sea was composed of the blood that had been shed by piety in furthering the kingdom of the Prince of Peace, and was reputed to be the largest ocean in existence, and explained the nonsensical saying which Jurgen had so often heard as to hell's being paved with good intentions. For Epigenes of Rhodes is right after all, said Jurgen, in suggesting a misprint, and the word should be laved. Why, to be sure, your majesty, asserted Florimel. Ah, but I always said your majesty had remarkable powers of penetration, quite apart from your majesty's scholarship. For Florimel had this cajoling way of speaking. Nonetheless, all vampires have their foibles, and are nourished by the vigor and youth of their lovers. So one morning, Florimel complained of being unwell, and had attributed it to indigestion. Jurgen stroked her head meditatively, then he opened his glittering shirt and displayed what was plain enough to see. I am full of vigor, and I am young, said Jurgen, but my vigor and my youthfulness are of a peculiar sort, and are not wholesome. So let us have no more of your tricks, or you will quite spoil your vacation by being very ill indeed. But I had thought all emperors were human, said Florimel, in a flutter of blushing penitence, exceedingly pretty to observe. Even so, sweetheart, all emperors are not Jurgens, he replied magnificently. Therefore, you will find that not every emperor is justly styled the father of his people, or is qualified by nature to wield the scepter of Numaria. I trust this lesson will suffice. It will, said Florimel with a wry face. So thereafter they had no further trouble of this sort, and the wound on Jurgen's breast was soon healed. And Jurgen kept away from the damned, of course, because he and Florimel were living respectably. They paid a visit to Jurgen's father, however, very shortly after they were married, because this was the proper thing to do. And Koth was civil enough for Koth, and voiced the hope that Florimel might have a good influence upon Jurgen and make him worth his salt, but did not pretend to be optimistic. Yet this visit was never returned, because Koth considered his wickedness was too great for him to be spared a moment of torment, and so would not leave his flame. And really, your majesty, said Florimel, I do not wish for an instant to have the appearance of criticizing your majesty's relatives. But I do think that your majesty's father might have called upon us at least once, particularly after I offered to have a fire made up for him to sit on any time he chose to come. I consider that your majesty's father assumed somewhat extravagant airs in the lack of any definite proof as to his having been a bit more wicked than anybody else, and the childlike candor which has always been with me a leading characteristic prevents concealment of my opinion. Oh, it is just his conscience, dear. A conscience is all very well in its place, your majesty. And I, for one, would never have been able to endure the interminable labor of seducing and assassinating so many fine young fellows if my conscience had not assured me that it was all the fault of my sister-in-law. But even so, there is no sense in letting your conscience make a slave of you. And when conscience reduces your majesty's father to ignoring the rules of common civility and behaving like a candlewick, I am sure that matters are being carried too far. And right you are, my dear. However, we do not lack for company. So come now, make yourself fine and shake the black dog from your back, for we are spending the evening with the Asmodeuses. And will your majesty talk politics again? Oh, I suppose so. They appear to like it. I only wish that I did, your majesty, observed Florimel, and she yawned by anticipation. For with the devils Jurgen got on garrulously. The religion of hell is patriotism, and the government is an enlightened democracy. This contented the devils, and Jurgen had learned long ago never to fall out with either of these codes, without which, as the devils were fond of observing, hell would not be what it is. They were, to Jurgen's finding, simple-minded fiends, who allowed themselves to be deplorably overworked by the importunate dead. They got no rest because of the damned, who were such persons as had been saddled with a conscience, and who in consequence demanded interminable torments. And at the time of Jurgen's coming into hell, political affairs were in a very bad way, because there was a considerable party among the younger devils who were for compounding the age-old war with heaven at almost any price, in order to get relief from this unceasing influx of conscientious dead persons in search of torment. For it was well known that when Satan submitted to be bound in chains, there would be no more death, and the annoying immigration would thus be ended. So said the younger devils, and considered Grandfather Satan ought to sacrifice himself for the general welfare. Then, too, they pointed out that Satan had been perforce their presiding magistrate ever since the settlement of hell, because a change of administration is expedient in wartime, so that Satan must term after term be re-elected. And of course, Satan had been voted absolute power in everything, since this too is customary in wartime. Well, and after the first few thousand years of this, the younger devils began to whisper that such government was not ideal democracy. But their more conservative elders were enraged by these effete and wild new notions, and dealt with their juniors somewhat severely, tearing them into bits and quite destroying them. The elder devils were proceeded to inflict even more startling punishments. So Grandfather Satan was much vexed, because the laws were being violated everywhere, and a day or two after Jurgen's advent, Satan issued a public appeal to his subjects that the code of hell should be better respected. But under a democratic government, people do not like to be perpetually bothered about law and order, as one of the older and stronger devils pointed out to Jurgen. Jurgen drew a serious face and he stroked his chin. "Why, but look you," says Jurgen, in deploring the mob spirit that has been manifesting itself sporadically throughout this country against the advocates of peace and submission to the commands of heaven and other pro-celestial propaganda, and in warning loyal citizenship that such outbursts must be guarded against as hurtful to the public welfare of hell. Why, Grandfather Satan should bear in mind that the government in large measure holds the remedy of the evil in its own hands. And Jurgen looked very severely towards Satan. "Come now," says Phlegiston, nodding his head, which was like that of a bear except for his naked long red ears, inside each of which was a flame like that of a spirit lamp. "Come now, but this young emperor in the fine shirt speaks uncommonly well." "So we spoke together in pandemonium," said Belial, wistfully, "in the brave days when pandemonium was newly built, and we were all imps together." "Yes, his talk is of the old school, that which there is none better. So pray continue, Emperor Jurgen," cried the elderly devils, "and let us know what you are talking about." "Why, merely this," says Jurgen, and again he looked severely towards Satan. "I tell you that as long as sentimental weakness marks the prosecution of offenses and violation of the laws necessitated by wartime conditions, as long as deserved punishment for overt acts of pro-celestialism is withheld, as long as weak-kneed clemency condones even a suspicion of disloyal thinking, then just as long will a righteously incensed, if now and then misguided patriotism take into its own hands vengeance upon the offenders." "But still," said Grandfather Satan, "ineffectual in administration of the law," continued Jurgen sternly, is the true defense of these outbursts, and far more justly deplorable than acts of mob violence is the policy of condemnation that furnishes occasion for them. The patriotic people of hell are not in a temper to be trifled with now that they are at war. Conviction for offenses against the nation should not be hedged about with technicalities devised for over-refined peacetime jurisprudence. Why, there is no one of you, I am sure, but has at his tongue's tip the immortal words of Livonius, as to this very topic, and so I shall not repeat them. But I fancy you will agree with me that what Livonius says is unanswerable. So it was that Jurgen went on at a great rate and looked always very sternly at Grandfather Satan. Yes, yes, said Satan, wiggling uncomfortably, but still not thinking of Jurgen entirely. Yes, all this is excellent oratory, and not for a moment would I decry the authority of Livonius. And your quotation is uncommonly apropos, and all that sort of thing. But with what are you charging me? With sentimental weakness, retorted Jurgen. Was it not only yesterday one of the younger devils was brought before you upon the charge that he had said the climate in heaven was better than the climate here? And you, sir, hell's chief magistrate, you it was who actually asked him if he had ever uttered such a disloyal heresy. Now, but what else was I to do? Said Satan, fidgeting and swishing his great bushy tail so that it rustled against his horns, and still not really turning his mind from that ancient thought. You should have remembered, sir, that a devil whose patriotism is impugned is a devil to be punished, and that there is no time to be prying into irrelevant questions of his guilt or innocence. Otherwise, I take it, you will never have any real democracy in hell. Now Jurgen looked very impressive, and the devils were all cheering him. And so, says Jurgen, your disgusted hearers were wearied by such frivolous interrogatories, and took the fellow out of your hands and tore him into particularly small bits. Now I warn you, Grandfather Satan, that it is your duty as a democratic magistrate just so to deal with such offenders first of all, and to ask your silly questions afterward. For what does Ridegurnas say outright upon this point, and Xantifer Magnus too? Why, my dear sir, I ask you plainly, where in the entire history of international jurisprudence will you find any more explicit language than these two employ? Now, certainly, says Satan with his bleak smile, you cite very respectable authority, and I shall take your reproof in good part. I will endeavor to be more strict in the future, and you must not blame my laxity too severely, Emperor Jurgen, for it is a long while since any man came living into hell to instruct us how to manage matters in time of war. No doubt, precisely as you say, we do need a little more severity hereabouts, and would gain by adopting more human methods. Rudigernus now. Yes, Rudigernus is rather unanswerable, and I concede it frankly. So do you come home and have supper with me, Emperor Jurgen, and we will talk over these things. Then Jurgen went off arm in arm with Grandfather Satan, and Jurgen's erudition and sturdy common sense were forevermore established among the older and more solid element in hell. And Satan followed Jurgen's suggestions, and the threatened rebellion was satisfactorily discouraged by tearing into very small fragments anybody who grumbled about anything, so that all the subjects of Satan went about smiling broadly all the time at the thought of what might befall them if they seemed dejected. Thus was hell a happier looking place because of Jurgen's coming. Chapter 39 of Compromises in Hell. Now Grandfather Satan's wife was called Phyllis, and apart from having wings like a bat's, she was the loveliest little ship of devilishness that Jurgen had seen in a long while. Jurgen spent this night at the Black House at Baratham, and 2 more nights, or it might be 3 nights, and the details of what Jurgen used to do there after supper when he would walk alone in the Black House gardens among the artfully colored cast-iron flowers and shrubbery, and would so come to the grated windows of Phyllis's room, and would stand there joking with her in the dark, are not requisite to the story. Satan was very jealous of his wife, and kept one of her wings clipped and held her under lock and key as the treasure that she was. But Jurgen was accustomed to say afterward that while the gratings over the windows were very formidable, they only seemed somehow to enhance the piquancy of his commerce with Dame Phyllis. This queen, said Jurgen, he had found simply unexcelled in repartee. Florimel considered the saying cryptic. Just what precisely did His Majesty mean? Why, that, in any and all circumstances, Dame Phyllis knows how to take a joke, and to return as good as she receives. So your Majesty has already informed me, and certainly jokes can be exchanged through a grating. Yes, that is what I meant. And Dame Phyllis appeared to appreciate my ready flow of humor. She informs me Grandfather Satan is of a cold, dry temperament, and very little humor in him, so that they go for months without exchanging any pleasantries. Well, I am willing to taste any drink once. And for the rest, remembering that my host had very enormous and intimidating horns, I was at particular pains to deal fairly with my hostess. Though indeed it was more for the honor and the glory of the affair than anything else that I exchanged pleasantries with Satan's wife. For to do that, my dear, I felt was unworthy of the Emperor Jurgen. Ah, I am afraid your Majesty is a sad scapegrace, replied Florimel. However, we all know that the scepter of an emperor is respected everywhere. Indeed, says Jurgen, I have often regretted that I did not bring with me my jeweled scepter when I left Numaria. She shivered at some unspoken thought. It was not until some while afterward that Florimel told Jurgen of her humiliating misadventure with the absent-minded Sultan of Garcio's scepter. Now she only replied that jewels might conceivably seem ostentatious and out of place. Jurgen agreed to this truism, for of course they were living very quietly, and Jurgen was splendid enough for any reasonable wife's requirements in his glittering shirt. So Jurgen got on pleasantly with Florimel, but he never became as fond of her as he had been of Guinevere or Anatius, nor 1/10 as fond of her as he had been of Caloris. In the first place, he suspected that Florimel had been invented by his father, and Koth and Jurgen had never any taste in common. And in the second place, Jurgen could not but see that Florimel thought a great deal of his being an emperor. It is my title she loves, not me, reflected Jurgen sadly, and her affection is less for that which is really integral to me than for imperial orbs and scepters and such life external trappings. And Jurgen would come out of Florimel's cleft considerably dejected, and would sit alone by the sea of blood, and would meditate how inequitable it was that the mere title of emperor should thus shut him off from sincerity and candor. We who are called kings and emperors are men like other men. We are as rightly entitled as other persons to the solace of true love and affection. Instead, we live in a continuous isolation. And women offer us all things save their hearts, and we are a lonely folk. No, I cannot believe that Florimel loves me for myself alone. It is my title which dazzles her. And I would that I had never made myself the Emperor of Nemoria. For this emperor goes about everywhere in a fabulous splendor, and is very naturally resistless in his semi-mythical magnificence. Ah, but these imperial gewgaws distract the thoughts of Florimel from the real Jurgen, so that the real Jurgen is a person whom she does not understand at all, and it is not fair. Then, too, he had a sort of prejudice against the way in which Florimel spent her time in seducing and murdering young men. It was not possible, of course, actually to blame the girl, since she was the victim of circumstances and had no choice about becoming a vampire once the cat had jumped over her coffin. Still, Jurgen always felt in his illogical masculine way that her vocation was not nice, and equally in the illogical way of men did not persist in coaxing Florimel to tell him of her vampiric transactions, in spite of his underlying feeling that he would prefer to have his wife engaged in some other trade. And the merry little creature would humor him willingly enough, with her purple eyes a-sparkle, and with her vivid lips curling prettily back, so as to show her tiny white sharp teeth quite plainly. She was really very pretty thus, as she told him of what happened in Copenhagen, when young Count Osmond went down into the blind beggar woman's cellar, and what they did with bits of him, and of how one kind of serpent came to have a secret name, which when cried aloud in the night with the appropriate ceremony will bring about delicious happenings, and of what one can do with small unchristened children, if only they do not kiss you with their moist, uncertain little mouths, for then this thing is impossible, and of what use she had made of young Sir Ganelon's skull when he was through with it, and she with him, and of what the young priest Wulfnorth had said to the crocodiles at the very last. Oh yes, my life has its amusing side, said Florimel, and one likes to feel, of course, that one is not wholly out of touch with things, and is even in one's modest way contributing to the suppression of folly. But even so, Your Majesty, the calls that are made upon one, the things that young men expect of you as the price of their bodily and spiritual ruin, and the things their relatives say about you, and above all, the constant strain, the irregular hours, and the continued effort to live up to one's position. Oh, yes, Your Majesty. I was far happier when I was a consumptive seamstress, and took pride in my buttonholes. But from a sister-in-law who only has you in to tea occasionally as a matter of duty, and who is prominent in church work, one may of course expect anything. And that reminds me that I really must tell Your Majesty about what happened in the hayloft, just after the abbot had finished undressing. So she would chatter away while Jurgen listened and smiled indulgently, for she certainly was very pretty. And so they kept house in hell contentedly enough until Florimel's vacation was at an end, and then they parted, without any tears, but in perfect friendliness. And Jurgen always remembered Florimel most pleasantly, but not as a wife with whom he had ever been on terms of actual intimacy. Now, when this lovely vampire had quitted him, the Emperor Jurgen, in spite of his general popularity and the deference accorded his political views, was not quite happy in hell. "It is a comfort, at any rate," said Jurgen, "to discover who originated the theory of democratic government. I have long wondered who started the notion that the way to get a wise decision of any conceivable question was to submit it to a popular vote. Now I know. Well, and the devils may be right in their doctrines. Certainly I cannot go so far as to say that they are wrong. But still, at the same time, for instance, this interminable effort to make the universe safe for democracy, this continually warring against heaven because heaven clung to a tyrannical form of autocratic government, sounded both logical and magnanimous, and was, of course, the only method of ensuring any general triumph for democracy. Yet it seemed rather futile to Jurgen, since, as he knew now, there was certainly something in the celestial system which made for military efficiency, so that heaven usually won. Moreover, Jurgen could not get over the fact that hell was just a notion of his ancestors, with which Cauchy had happened to fall in. For Jurgen had never much patience with antiquated ideas, particularly when anyone put them into practice, as Cauchy had done. "Why, this place appears to me a glaring anachronism," said Jurgen, brooding over the fire of Chorasma. "And its methods of tormenting conscientious people I cannot but consider very crude indeed. The devils are simple-minded, and they mean well, as nobody would dream of denying, but that is just it. For hereabouts is needed some more pertinacious and efficiently disagreeable person." And that, of course, reminded him of Dame Lisa. And so it was the thoughts of Jurgen turned again to doing the manly thing. And he sighed, and went among the devils, tentatively looking and inquiring for that intrepid fiend who, in the form of a black gentleman, had carried off Dame Lisa. But a queer happening befell, and it was that nowhere could Jurgen find the black gentleman, nor did any of the devils know anything about him. "From what you tell us, Emperor Jurgen," said they all, "your wife was an acidulous shrew, and the sort of woman who believes that whatever she does is right." "It was not a belief," says Jurgen. "It was a mania with the poor dear. But by that fact then, she is forever debarred from entering hell." "You tell me news," says Jurgen, which if generally known, would lead many husbands into vicious living. But it is notorious that people are saved by faith, and there is no faith stronger than that of a bad-tempered woman in her own infallibility. Plainly, this wife of yours is the sort of person who cannot be tolerated by anybody short of the angels. We deduce that your empress must be in heaven." "Well, that sounds reasonable. And so to heaven I will go, and it may be that there I shall find justice." "We would have you know," the fiends cried, bristling, "that in hell we have all kinds of justice, since our government is an enlightened democracy." "Just so," says Jurgen, "and an enlightened democracy, one has all kinds of justice, and I would not dream of denying it. But you have not, you conceive, the lesser plague, my wife, and it is she whom I must continue to look for." "Oh, as you like," said they, "so long as you do not criticize the exigencies of wartime. but certainly we are sorry to see you going into a country where the benighted people put up with an autocrat who was not duly elected to his position. And why need you continue seeking your wife's society when it is so much pleasanter living in hell? And Jurgen shrugged. One has to do the manly thing sometimes. So the fiends told him the way to heaven's frontiers, pitying him. But the crossing of the frontier must be your affair. I have a cantrip, said Jurgen, and my stay in hell has taught me how to use it. Then Jurgen followed his instructions and went into Meridai, and turned to the left when he had come to the great puddle where the adders and toads are reared, and so passed through the mist of Tartarus with due care of the wild lightning, and took the second turn to his left. Always in seeking heaven, be guided by your heart, had been the advice given him by devils, and thus avoiding the abode of Gemra, he crossed the bridge over the bottomless pit and the solitary Narakas. And Brachus, who kept the toll gate on this bridge, did that of which the fiends had forewarned Jurgen, but for this, of course, there was no help. That was a lot. And Jurgen leaves hell, and we're getting towards the end of the book. And that's good because it's getting towards the end of Periscope as well. But these readings will be archived, and archived on YouTube at Roarshock channel. Go there and subscribe. And thanks for listening.